October 25th, 1944, off Samar. 17-knot escort carriers running for their lives. Shell splashes climbing around them like steel geysers. And then Evans, bleeding, furious, impossibly calm, turns USS Johnston straight at a cruiser line 10 times his size. He's not trying to win. He's buying minutes, and minutes are life. This is the moment one destroyer's crazy charge broke a Japanese attack that should have crushed the Pacific Fleet.
October 25, 1944. Off the coast of Samar Island, the Western Pacific. The sea was the color of lead under a sky that refused to commit to either storm or calm. Dawn had broken only minutes before, pale and indifferent, casting no shadows across the water. At 06:45 hours, lookouts aboard the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay spotted what they first believed to be their own fleet on the horizon. Within seconds, the awful truth materialized through their binoculars. Pagoda masts rising like ancient temples from the steel hulls of battleships. The largest naval surface force Japan had committed to battle in 2 years was bearing down on them at 25 knots. And between the American escort carriers and certain annihilation stood only 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and the thin morning air. The battle off Samar would be remembered by military historians as the most unlikely naval engagement of the Pacific War. A confrontation so asymmetric that Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded vessels displacing more than 10 times the tonnage of the American screening force. His center force included the Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, mounting 18-inch guns that could hurl a projectile weighing more than an automobile over 25 miles. Supporting her were 3 other battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Against this armada stood Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's PASC Unit 77.43, known by the call sign Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers built on merchant hulls designed for anti-submarine patrol and ground support, not fleet engagement. Their maximum speed was 17 knots. Their largest guns were 5-inch deck batteries intended to ward off aircraft, not penetrate capital ship armor. What happened in the hours that followed would defy every principle taught at naval war colleges, contradict every mathematical prediction of combat outcomes, and stand as testimony to a peculiar American quality that the Imperial Japanese Navy had consistently underestimated: the willingness to charge forward when retreat was rational, when survival was improbable, when the calculus of steel and explosive weight suggested only one logical conclusion. This is the story of USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing 2,700 tons, and her commander, Ernest E. Evans, a Cherokee from Oklahoma, who wore his tribal heritage as openly as his Navy uniform, and who would, on this October morning, demonstrate what happened when American audacity collided with Japanese expectation. By the autumn of 1944, Japan's strategic position had deteriorated beyond recovery, though its military leadership refused to acknowledge the mathematical certainty of defeat. The American invasion of Leyte in the Philippines represented not merely another island lost, but the severing of Japan's southern supply lines: the oil from the Dutch East Indies, the rubber from Malaya, the rice from Indochina. Without the Philippines, the home islands would starve, and the combined fleet would become an immobile monument to imperial ambition. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, conceived Operation Sho-Go, Victory Operation, a plan of such complexity and desperation that it required perfect timing, complete surprise, and the willing sacrifice of Japan's remaining carrier force as a decoy. 3 separate naval forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions. The Northern Force, built around Japan's last operational carriers, would lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet north, away from the landing beaches. With Halsey's battleships and fleet carriers gone, Admiral Kurita's center force would transit the San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness and fall upon the American invasion fleet at dawn, annihilating the transports and supply vessels that sustained MacArthur's ground forces. The plan very nearly worked. On October 24th, Kurita's center force endured devastating air attacks while crossing the Sibuyan Sea. The super battleship Musashi, sister to Yamato, absorbed 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo strikes over the course of 4 hours before finally capsizing, taking over 1,000 men with her. Kurita reversed course, appearing to retreat. American reconnaissance flights reported him sailing away from the invasion beaches. That night, Halsey's carriers and battleships steamed north to engage the Japanese carrier decoy force, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded except for a patrol of 3 destroyers that failed to detect Kurita when he reversed course again after dark and slipped through the strait. At dawn on October 25th, Kurita's battered but still formidable fleet emerged into the Philippine Sea east of Samar, expecting to find unarmed transports and supply ships. Instead, he encountered Taffy 3's escort carriers, mistook them for fleet carriers, and ordered a general attack. For Admiral Sprague and his screening force, there would be no reinforcements, no time for intricate tactical planning, no opportunity for anything except immediate action. The escort carriers turned east and ran, launching every aircraft they could get airborne, generating smoke, transmitting desperate pleas for help on every frequency. Their survival depended entirely on the destroyers and destroyer escorts of their screen, and these vessels faced a choice that was not really a choice at all. Withdraw behind the carriers and die slowly, or attack into overwhelming firepower and die quickly while buying time. Commander Ernest Evans required no deliberation. At 7:16 hours, 12 minutes after Japanese shells began straddling the escort carriers, he ordered Johnston to flank speed and pointed her bow directly at the center of Kurita's formation. No orders from Admiral Sprague had been received. No coordinated attack plan existed. Evans simply attacked, alone, accelerating to 35 knots, closing the range to targets that displaced 15 times his ship's tonnage. There exists in American military culture a particular species of insanity that appears indistinguishable from courage until examined in retrospect. It manifests in Confederate charges across open ground at Gettysburg, in Marine Corps assaults against fortified Japanese positions in the Pacific, in Army Rangers scaling cliffs at Pointe du Hoc. It is tactically irrational, statistically suicidal, and occasionally decisive precisely because it introduces an element that rigid military doctrine cannot account for: the willingness to accept certain death as an acceptable cost of inflicting unexpected damage. Johnston possessed 10 torpedoes in 2 quintuple mounts and 5 5-inch guns in single turrets. Her armor consisted of thin steel plating designed to stop shell fragments, not armor-piercing rounds from 8-inch cruiser batteries. She was a Greyhound attacking Mastiffs, and her only advantages were speed, surprise, and the fact that her crew had trained together for 18 months under a commander who believed that retreat was a theoretical concept, interesting to discuss, but never to implement. Evans had made his philosophy explicit to his crew during the ship's commissioning ceremony in October 1943. Standing on the deck in Seattle, he had told the assembled sailors, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." No one had departed. Now, a year later, as Johnston surged forward through the swells toward the Japanese heavy cruiser column, every man aboard understood that their commander's words had been literal promise, not rhetorical flourish. The morning light remained gray and uncertain, but the Japanese ships stood out clearly against the western horizon. Massive steel fortresses bristling with guns, their pagoda superstructures unmistakable. Johnston's fire control team identified the lead heavy cruiser as Kumano, flagship of Cruiser Division 7, displacing 13,000 tons and mounting 10 8-inch guns. She was steaming at 28 knots, firing salvos at the fleeing escort carriers beyond. Her captain had not yet noticed the small destroyer accelerating toward his beam. At 18,000 yards, Johnston opened fire with her 5-inch batteries, the sharp crack of the guns punctuating the deeper thunder of Japanese salvos. The destroyer's shells could not penetrate cruiser armor at this range, but they could distract, could force the enemy to divide attention, could announce that someone was charging forward instead of fleeing. At 10,000 yards, Kumano's secondary batteries swiveled toward the approaching threat. At 9,000 yards, her main battery turrets began to track Johnston's narrow profile. At 7,000 yards, she fired. The difference between an 8-inch shell and a 5-inch shell is not merely caliber. It is the difference between an explosive projectile designed to mission kill a destroyer with a single strike and one designed to damage aircraft. When Kumano's first salvo arrived, it straddled Johnston with precision, geysers of seawater erupting 40 feet into the air on both sides of the destroyer's hull. The second salvo struck. One round penetrated the aft deckhouse, detonating inside and killing several men instantly. Another struck the portside waterline, flooding a fire room. A third hit turret 3, jamming it in train and killing or wounding everyone inside. Within 90 seconds, Johnston had absorbed 3 8-inch hits and multiple shell fragments from near misses. Her speed dropped to 28 knots. Smoke poured from her superstructure, and Commander Evans, standing on the bridge with blood running down his uniform from shrapnel wounds, never considered withdrawing. At 6,500 yards, point-blank range for a naval engagement, Johnston launched her torpedoes. All 10 weapons ran true, spreading in a fan toward the Japanese heavy cruiser column. The torpedoes were Mark 15 models, carrying 600 pounds of TNT and running at 46 knots. Their effective range was 6,000 yards at high speed, which meant Evans had closed to within the margin where launching torpedoes and surviving were mutually exclusive propositions. But the torpedoes were now in the water, and physics took over where courage ended. The Japanese cruisers scattered, turning hard to avoid the incoming tracks. Kumano, leading the column, turned too late. At least one torpedo, possibly 2, struck her bow, the detonations blowing away 40 feet of her forward hull and flooding her forward turret magazine. She dropped out of formation, listing to starboard, her speed reduced to 18 knots, no longer combat effective. The cruiser column dissolved into individual ships, maneuvering independently, their formation broken, their advance disrupted. Johnston turned away, generating smoke, dodging salvos from multiple Japanese cruisers, now fully aware that this small destroyer had damaged their division flagship. The logical action would have been to withdraw behind the smokescreen, to limp back toward the escort carriers and attempt repairs. But Admiral Sprague's voice came over the radio net, requesting destroyers to form up for a coordinated torpedo attack. And Evans, despite Johnston's damage, despite the wounded and dead below decks, despite every rational calculation of survival probability, turned back toward the Japanese fleet. The mathematics of abundance. The American destroyer represented a philosophical statement as much as a weapons platform. Unlike Japanese destroyers, which emphasized overwhelming torpedo armament at the expense of gun power and habitability, Fletcher-class destroyers embodied a balanced design that prioritized crew welfare, redundant systems, and sustained combat capability. They had air conditioning in tropical climates, bunks instead of hammocks, fresh water for bathing, ice cream machines, and a level of spare parts inventory that Japanese naval architects considered wasteful excess. This reflected a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy. Japan's shipyards operated under resource scarcity, building vessels that maximized lethality per ton of steel but offered no margin for damage or error. American shipyards operated under resource abundance, building vessels that accepted some inefficiency in exchange for resilience, repair capability, and crew endurance. A Japanese destroyer sailor ate rice and fish twice daily. An American destroyer sailor ate 3 hot meals, including meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, and dessert. This was not accidental, it was strategic. The Pacific War was, underneath its surface drama of carriers and battleships, a war of industrial production and logistical endurance. Japan entered the conflict with the third largest navy in the world and sophisticated, well-trained crews. But it could not replace losses at American rates. Every cruiser sunk, every destroyer damaged, every trained crew killed represented a depletion of finite resources. The United States commissioned new ships faster than Japan could sink them, trained new pilots faster than combat could kill them, and produced ammunition, fuel, and food in quantities that Japanese planners had calculated to be impossible. Johnston's crew carried this abundance into battle as unconsciously as they breathed. They did not ration ammunition. They did not calculate whether expending 5-inch shells against cruiser armor was wasteful. They fired because they had shells, and if they exhausted their magazines, more shells existed in rear areas by the millions. This material confidence translated into tactical audacity. A destroyer captain fighting with finite resources calculates conservation. A destroyer captain fighting with effectively infinite logistics calculates maximum effect. When Johnston rejoined the destroyer formation at 0730 hours for the coordinated torpedo attack, she was already combat damaged, down to 28 knots. Trailing smoke, her aft turret inoperable. Her sister ships Hull and Heermann charged forward alongside her, and behind them came the destroyer escorts, smaller, slower, more lightly armed vessels built on mass production lines, crewed by reservists, dismissed by pre-war naval professionals as inadequate substitutes for real warships. Together, this collection of destroyers and destroyer escorts, none displacing more than 2,700 tons, charged the battleship Yamato. The Yamato displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded. Her main battery consisted of 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. A single shell from these weapons weighed 3,200 pounds and could penetrate 16 inches of steel armor at 20 miles. Her secondary battery of 6-inch guns outranged and outweighed anything the American destroyers carried. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick. She was, by every quantifiable metric, invulnerable to destroyer attack. And yet, when the American destroyers charged, Yamato turned away. Admiral Kurita, standing on Yamato's bridge, watched the destroyers close and saw not small, insignificant targets, but a coordinated torpedo attack that, if allowed to reach launch range, might damage or sink his flagship. He had watched Musashi die the previous day from accumulated damage, and he understood that capital ships, no matter how massive, were vulnerable to massed torpedo strikes. He ordered evasive maneuvers. The Yamato turned north, away from the battle, opening range from the charging destroyers. The most powerful battleship afloat retreated from vessels she could have destroyed with her secondary batteries. This moment, this turning away, represented the psychological victory that Commander Evans and every other destroyer captain in Taffy 3's screen sought to achieve. They could not sink battleships, but they could force battleships to maneuver defensively. They could buy time. And in the mathematics of that October morning, time was the only currency that mattered. Hull died first, absorbing over 40 large-caliber hits before losing power, losing steering, losing the ability to fight. Her captain, Commander Leon Kintberger, gave the order to abandon ship at 0830 hours. She capsized 20 minutes later, taking 253 men with her. Of her crew of 330, only 77 survived, floating in oil-slicked water through the afternoon, clinging to debris, waiting for rescue that would not arrive for 2 days. Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort displacing only 1,400 tons, fought her way to within 4,000 yards of Japanese heavy cruisers before catastrophic hits penetrated her engine room. Her crew continued firing manually even after power failed, even after the bridge was destroyed, even after flooding guaranteed her sinking. She went down at 0910 hours. Of her 224 crew members, 89 died. Johnston survived until 0950 hours. After the second torpedo attack, she had withdrawn northeast. Every system damaged, speed reduced to 17 knots, listing 7 degrees to port. Her forward magazine was flooded. Her gyro compass was inoperative. All radio communication equipment had been destroyed. Commander Evans, wounded in multiple locations, refused medical treatment and remained on the bridge, conning the ship by hand signals to the aft steering station. At 9:20 hours, a Japanese destroyer squadron emerged from the smoke and engaged Johnston at close range. 5-inch shells cannot penetrate destroyer armor when fired at high angles, but at ranges under 5,000 yards, fired directly into a vessel's broadside, they can and did. Johnston returned fire, her remaining operational turrets scoring hits on the Japanese vessels, but the exchange was unequal. More shells penetrated her hull. More men died at their stations. The ship began to settle by the stern. At 9:45 hours, with Johnston dead in the water and clearly sinking, Commander Evans gave the order to abandon ship. The crew began going over the side, jumping into water that was warm and viscous with oil. 5 minutes later, a Japanese cruiser close to within 2,000 yards and poured fire into the dying destroyer, killing men in the water, killing men still aboard trying to launch life rafts, killing because that is what naval guns do when they fire. Johnston rolled to port and sank at 9:50 hours, going down in 600 fathoms of water. Commander Ernest E. Evans went down with her, last seen on the bridge, refusing to abandon his command. Ship. Of her crew of 327, only 141 survived. Evans would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American naval officer to receive the decoration. As Johnston slipped beneath the surface, survivors in the water reported seeing officers aboard the nearest Japanese destroyer stand at attention and salute the sinking American warship. This detail, recorded in multiple witness statements, would be dismissed by some historians as sentimental invention. But Japanese naval culture maintained a profound respect for courage in battle, and what Johnston and her sister ships had done that morning was, by any measure, worthy of respect. Admiral Kurita broke off the attack at 09:20 hours and ordered his fleet to withdraw north. His forces had sunk 1 escort carrier, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. They had damaged multiple other vessels. But they had not annihilated the American escort carrier force, had not reached the invasion beaches, had not accomplished the mission that Operation Sho-Go required. Historians would debate for decades why Kurita withdrew when victory seemed within reach. Whether he mistook escort carriers for fleet carriers and believed he faced superior forces, whether the ferocity of the destroyer attacks convinced him that more American ships were nearby, whether the constant air attacks from Taffy 3's aircraft and other escort carrier groups had exhausted his crews and ammunition. The most likely explanation is simpler. The battle had not proceeded according to plan. And when a plan unravels in the face of unexpected resistance, commanders begin to see threats everywhere. Kurita had expected to find unarmed transports fleeing in panic. Instead, he found destroyers charging his battleships, aircraft bombing and strafing despite lacking armor-piercing weapons, and escort carriers that refused to surrender, even when straddled by 14-inch shells. This was not how defeated enemies behaved. This was not consistent with Japanese intelligence assessments of declining American morale. This suggested the possibility, the terrible possibility, that more American forces were nearby, that he was sailing into a trap. So he withdrew, and with his withdrawal, the last Japanese attempt to disrupt the Philippines invasion collapsed. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 resumed flight operations. The surviving destroyers and destroyer escorts began rescue operations, pulling men from the water, treating the wounded, counting the dead. And historians began the work of understanding what had occurred. The battle off Samar would be analyzed in naval warfare courses for generations as an example of asymmetric engagement, of morale overcoming material disadvantage, of the unpredictable human factor in combat calculations. Japanese staff officers, interrogated after the war, expressed consistent bewilderment at American destroyer tactics. One commander stated that in the Imperial Navy, destroyers screening a carrier force would never attack battleships independently. They would wait for orders, form up properly, coordinate their attack to maximize effectiveness. The American destroyers had charged immediately, individually, without coordination, without apparent concern for survival. This was interpreted as either supreme confidence or supreme desperation, and the Japanese could not determine which. Both interpretations missed the essential point. American destroyer captains attacked because they believed attack was their function. They had been trained on a philosophy that emphasized initiative over obedience, immediate action over perfect planning, accepting losses to accomplish the mission. The mission at Samar was to protect the escort carriers. Charging battleships accomplished that mission. That the destroyers would likely die in the process was unfortunate but irrelevant to the tactical calculus. This cultural difference in military philosophy extended from the individual sailor to the strategic level. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual will, the belief that superior determination could overcome material disadvantage. American military doctrine emphasized material superiority, backed by adequate determination. When these philosophies collided, the American approach proved more durable. Spirit alone cannot reload empty magazines. Will cannot repair destroyed engines. Courage is necessary, but insufficient. What the American destroyers at Samar possessed was courage backed by industrial capacity, audacity supported by logistics, individual initiative enabled by a culture that rewarded rather than punished independent action. Commander Evans did not request permission to attack because he knew permission would be granted. He launched torpedoes at cruisers because he knew more torpedoes existed if he survived. He fought his ship until she sank because he knew other ships were being built by the dozens in American shipyards, and his sacrifice would be meaningful rather than merely tragic. Among the debris recovered from Johnston's sinking position, life preservers, furniture, documents rendered illegible by seawater, salvage crews found an incongruous object, a manual ice cream maker, standard equipment on Fletcher-class destroyers. It floated among the oil and debris, empty, functionless, but present. Ice cream machines did not belong on warships according to traditional naval architecture. They consumed electrical power, occupied valuable space, required maintenance and supplies. But they existed on every American destroyer because American naval doctrine held that crew morale was a combat multiplier, and small luxuries maintained morale during extended deployments. Japanese destroyers did not have ice cream machines. They had torpedo reloads, additional weapons, maximum armament at minimum displacement. On paper, this made them superior warships. In practice, it made them death traps for exhausted crews fed inadequate rations, granted inadequate rest, pushed beyond endurance by commanders who believed suffering built character. The ice cream machine floating in the Philippine Sea represented everything that Japanese military planners had dismissed as American weakness: the waste, the excess, the soft democratic unwillingness to sacrifice comfort for efficiency. But that ice cream machine had crossed the Pacific on a destroyer that charged battleships, crewed by sailors who were well-fed, well-rested, and consequently well-motivated to fight. Material comfort did not breed weakness. It bred the resilience to endure months at sea and still charge forward when charging meant dying. This same pattern repeated across the Pacific War. American submarines had air conditioning and refrigeration. Japanese submarines had minimal habitability and maximum torpedo loads. American aircraft carriers had elaborate damage control systems and crew facilities. Japanese carriers emphasized aircraft capacity and speed. When combat damaged these vessels, American ships survived and Japanese ships sank, not because American designs were invulnerable, but because American designs accepted that ships would be damaged and planned accordingly. The industrial abundance that produced ice cream machines also produced damage control equipment, spare parts, redundant systems, and the margins that separated survival from catastrophe. Johnston absorbed dozens of hits before sinking and remained combat effective throughout because Fletcher-class design philosophy assumed damage and engineered survivability. A Japanese destroyer of equivalent displacement absorbing the same punishment would have sunk faster because every ton of steel was allocated to weapons rather than resilience. This was the calculus that Japanese admirals failed to incorporate into their assessments. They counted guns and torpedoes, displacement and speed, but they did not count the invisible factors: the well-fed crews, the abundant supplies, the logistical infrastructure that meant damaged ships could be repaired quickly and returned to service. They saw American material excess as decadence rather than recognizing it as the foundation of American combat power. The long accounting. The battle off Samar cost the U.S. Navy approximately 1,500 men killed and missing, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and 1 escort carrier sunk. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk and multiple other vessels damaged, but the greater loss was strategic. Operation Sho-Go failed completely. The Philippines remained in American hands, and Japan's southern supply lines were permanently severed. The war would continue for another 10 months, but after Samar, Japanese naval power existed only as scattered remnants, incapable of coordinated fleet action. In the immediate aftermath, survivors floated in the water for up to 2 days before rescue vessels located them. Many died from wounds, exposure, or shark attacks during this period. Those who survived spoke consistently of the same experience: exhaustion so complete that death seemed preferable, yet somehow finding the strength to continue swimming, continue holding on to debris, continue refusing to the warm water and the easy descent into darkness. This too was characteristically American: the stubborn refusal to quit even when quitting was rational. Japanese military culture emphasized accepting death when defeat was certain, dying with honor rather than enduring the shame of survival. American military culture emphasized surviving, even without honor, even in humiliation, because survival meant the possibility of eventual victory, and death meant certainty of defeat. The men who floated in the Philippine Sea
after Johnston sank were not thinking about grand strategy or cultural philosophy. They were thinking about water, about the next breath, about the sharks circling below. But their refusal to give up, their animal determination to survive, reflected the same quality that had driven their destroyer to charge battleships: a fundamental, inarticulate belief that their side would win because their side always won, that the war was already decided, and they merely had to endure until mathematical certainty became historical fact. Commander Ernest E. Evans was posthumously promoted to captain and awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation noted his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. This language, standard for the decoration, somehow failed to capture what Evans had actually done, which was to charge into certain death not from gallantry or intrepidity, but from a calculated judgment that his death would purchase time, and time would save the carriers, and saving the carriers would preserve the invasion fleet, and preserving the invasion fleet would maintain American momentum in the Pacific. His calculus proved correct. The escort carriers survived. The invasion proceeded. The Philippines were liberated. The war continued on schedule toward its inevitable conclusion. And Johnston's charge became a story told at the Naval Academy, studied in tactics courses, analyzed by officers learning when rules should be broken and when breaking rules becomes necessity. But what the tactical analyses often missed was the singular nature of that October morning, the way the gray light lay across the water, the thunder of guns rolling across the swells, the bitter taste of powder smoke mixed with salt spray, the vibration of a destroyer's engines at flank speed transmitted through steel decks into the soles of boots, the moment when Commander Evans pointed his ship at the enemy fleet and gave the order that everyone knew was a death sentence, but obeyed anyway, because that was what they had trained to do, what they had promised to do, what Americans did when confronted with impossible choices. The Japanese cruiser, captains who fought at Samar returned to port confused, angry, certain that they had engaged fleet carriers and heavy cruisers because the alternative, that they had been fought to a standstill by escort carriers and destroyers, was too humiliating to acknowledge. The truth emerged slowly, pieced together from American after-action reports and reluctant Japanese admissions. The truth was that 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts had disrupted an entire battle fleet.
that vessels displacing a few thousand tons had forced vessels displacing tens of thousands of tons into defensive maneuvers, that the weakest American screening force in the Pacific had achieved what the mightiest Japanese battle fleet could not. They had stayed in the fight until the fight was won. The wreck of USS Johnston rests in 20,400 feet of water off Samar Island, deeper than the Titanic, deeper than almost any other warship yet discovered. In 2019, a civilian research expedition located her remains, filming the broken hull resting upright on the seafloor, her turrets still visible, her bridge collapsed but recognizable. The footage showed marine life inhabiting the wreckage, coral growing on steel, the ocean slowly reclaiming what war had cast away. No human remains were visible, which was proper. The ocean had taken the dead and absorbed them decades before, leaving only the steel monument to mark where they had fought. The researchers noted that Johnston had sunk deeper than any other warship ever located, and yet her hull number, 557, was still faintly visible on her bow, painted white against gray, a final identifier for a ship that needed no introduction. The battle site itself is unmarked by any monument except the water itself, which is monument enough. The Philippine Sea continues its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human dramas played out on its surface, caring nothing for the nations that sent their sons to die in its waters, remembering nothing except the slow accumulation of wrecks on its floor. This is appropriate. War is temporary. The ocean is permanent. The men who fought off Samar in October 1944 are gone, and
the ships they crewed are gone, and the nations they represented have changed beyond recognition. But the water remains, and the wrecks remain, and the story remains. It remains because it represents something that transcends the specific tactical details of one naval engagement in one theater of one war. It represents the moment when courage and calculation intersected, when individual initiative collided with overwhelming force, when a commander made a decision that was simultaneously suicidal and correct, when a crew followed orders that meant death but accomplished the mission, when a nation's industrial might and democratic culture combined to produce sailors who would charge battleships in destroyers and believe they could win. They did win. Not by sinking the enemy fleet, they lacked the weapons for that. They won by refusing to lose, by fighting until the enemy gave up, by transforming a battle that should have been a massacre into an engagement that the Japanese remembered as desperate confusion. They won because winning was the only option their culture recognized, because retreat was philosophically impossible even when tactically necessary, because somewhere in the American character existed a stubborn, irrational conviction that courage mattered more than tonnage, that spirit could multiply material, that a single destroyer charging a cruiser line was not insanity, but duty. The ice cream machine that floated in the debris field off Samar eventually sank, claimed by the same waters that took the men and the ship. But before it sank, it symbolized what the Imperial Japanese Navy never understood about American power. That the nation capable of putting ice cream machines on destroyers was the same nation capable of industrial output that exceeded the rest of the world combined. That the culture soft enough to value crew comfort was the same culture hard enough to charge into annihilating fire. That the democratic excess Japanese planners mocked was actually the foundation of combat effectiveness they could never match. In the end, the battle off Samar was decided not by the ships themselves, but by the civilizations that built them, crewed them, and sent them into
combat with different philosophies about what men were worth and what sacrifices were acceptable. One civilization built ships as weapons, maximizing lethality, accepting minimal survivability. The other built ships as platforms for men, accepting some inefficiency to preserve crew effectiveness. When these philosophies met off Samar, the ships built for men outlasted and outfought the ships built as weapons, because the men made the difference, and the culture that produced those men, the culture of abundance, initiative, and stubborn refusal to accept defeat, proved more durable than imperial will or spiritual determination. USS Johnston lies now in eternal darkness, her war finished, her mission complete, her sacrifice remembered. The ocean presses down with crushing force on her broken hull. The cold is absolute. The silence is complete. And somewhere in that darkness, beneath 20,000 feet of water, rests the proof that courage, when backed by industrial might and cultural confidence, can transform impossible odds into legendary victory, not through magic or miracle, but through the simple, terrible arithmetic of men willing to die buying time, and a nation willing to spend steel and lives to preserve the principle that freedom was worth defending with everything they had. The thunder of Johnston's guns has long since faded, but the echo remains, carried forward through decades, through generations, through every naval officer who studies that October morning, and understands that sometimes the calculus of war cannot be reduced to tonnage and firepower, that sometimes the human factor multiplies or negates all material advantages, that sometimes a single ship's crazy charge shatters not just a cruiser line, but the enemy's certainty of victory. And in that shattering, history turned, and the tide that seemed inexorable became merely inevitable, and the war that Japan believed could be won through will and spirit was lost to factories and farms, to logistics and abundance, to the simple, overwhelming fact that America could afford to lose 100 destroyers and build 200 more, while Japan lost 3 cruisers off Samar and could replace none. That was the lesson written in steel and courage. Blood in the Philippine Sea on October 25, 1944. That was the truth Commander Evans and his crew proved with their lives. That was why Johnston charged, why she fought, and why she sank. To buy time for carriers, to preserve an invasion, to maintain momentum toward a victory that was always certain but never guaranteed until the final gun fell silent and the final ship went down and the ocean reclaimed its surface for purposes other than war. The sea off Samar is quiet now, peaceful, marked only by the passage of merchant vessels and fishing boats whose crews know nothing of the battle fought in these waters 80 years ago. The wind still raises swells that march eastward toward the horizon. The sun still rises gray and uncertain on October mornings. And deep below, in darkness and silence, Johnston keeps her final station, testimony to the day when a destroyer's charge shattered a battle fleet and proved that in war, as in all human endeavors, courage backed by conviction and supported by abundance can achieve what calculation declares impossible. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes when it matters most, when the outcome hangs uncertain and the moment demands more than reason can justify. When men charge forward not because victory is certain, but because retreat is unthinkable. When the thunder of guns drown out the mathematics of defeat, and spirit, for one brief morning, equals steel.